Intellectual property today is huge. It is probably one of the things that occupies lawyers to a huge degree because there is so much intellectual property that is being pirated on the internet today. It is one of the things that has almost destroyed the music industry as the way it used to run. And it has, arguably created more creativity because intellectual property is freer than ever. But at the same time, it creates frustration to creative artists who want to be able to be compensated for their work. And in a free market today on the, in cyberspace, it's very difficult to do that. The first time where we really get into a very serious discussion about intellectual property and the rights of the creator of that property is in the 19th century. I don't know why it took so long, because after all, the issues of intellectual property really revolve around the printing press. You don't have to wait for new technology to be concerned about intellectual property. But apparently the world at large had not yet made it a concern. In other words, larger society had not made it a concern until the 19th century. Yes?
Between Tzig and Laura prints, that wasn't an issue?
Again, you get into this. This happens in the 19th century.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah, that's the 19th century. This is all very recent. The printing press has been around, and you do have tshuvas even from the Ramah going back several centuries that talk about a prohibition. When they would write a haskama to a sefer, a great rabbi would say it's prohibited for a person to republish this without getting permission of the publisher, and so forth. But there's never really a substantive discussion about the halachic nature of taking someone else's intellectual property, other than it's not the right thing to do or it's usher to do, but without really going into the nitty-gritty. Tonight is merely an introduction, and the reason what I'd like to do with you, at least to begin to do with you tonight, is to go over two tshuvas. One is the teacher and one is the student. It's very curious that this happens in Poland in the middle of the 19th century. The first tshuva is from the Shoel Umeshiv, which is written by a Rav Yoseph Shoel Nathanson, who was the Dayan and the Rav in Lvov, or Lemberg. And then we have another tshuva from the Beis Yitzchak, who was Rav Yitzchak Yehuda Shmelkes, who was a Talmud of Rav Yosef Shoel Nathanson, who acknowledges his Rebbe in the tshuva and then ends up disagreeing with him. And you see that the whole concept of intellectual property is very vague. It's not a crystallized concept, even at this point. So let's take a look. We're going to start with the Shoel Umeshiv. This is really, he starts the tshuva in Mahadura Kama Chelak Aleph Siman Mendala, just as a derech agav. Those are the words. He says, just by, incidentally, now that we're discussing halachic issues, I want to throw this issue in as well. And he tells us about a story that there was a certain rabbi named Aleph Yud, he doesn't name him by name, who has purchased the rights of the printing of a new Shulchan Aruch that has a whole bunch of these really amazing new commentaries that are hard to find in a Shulchan Aruch. What are these commentaries? He writes the commentaries are the Pri Megadim, the Chavos Das, and the Pischei Tshuva. Now those, of course, are commonly printed in all of our Shulchan Aruchs, but in those days, you were lucky if you had the Shach and the Taz and the Magen Avraham to get all of these other amazing achronim, especially the Pischei Tshuva, which was a milaket. He gathered together a whole bunch of different tshuvas. You have it right there on the page. Wow, amazing. So there's another person who's his disputant who says, no, I have just as much of a right as you do to print this Shulchan Aruch that you purchased the rights from the original printer, the person who put it all on the printing press. I'm going to print it also. And this Rabbi Aleph Yud comes to the Shoel Umeshiv and says, don't I have a right since I purchased the rights of publishing from this individual? And so we're just going to do the underlined sections of the tshuva. He says, V'kan ha-mechaber atzmo. So what was the argument of the counterclaim of this Rabbi Aleph Yud? The counterclaim against him from this person whose name is Rabbi Yosef Tzvi. He says, V'kan ha-mechaber atzmo ein lo koach u'zuchus bazeh me'achar shebahadfasa rishona shnas tav kuf tzadi vav lo nizkar shum isur. He says, because when the first time the publication came out with the Shulchan Aruch with these extra commentaries, in the year Tav Kuf Tzadi Vav, he says, I got news for you. There was never any caveat or disclaimer that was mentioned that would prohibit the republication or the reprinting of this Shulchan Aruch in its form. V'im haya nizkar isur, haya efshar ladun sheyesh isur at kalos zeman shegaval. He says, if the original edition would have said, it's all rights reserved, copyright, and no one may republish this until such and such a time, he says, then there would be something to discuss. But when this Shulchan Aruch with these commentaries was first published, there was no such disclaimer. And ve'af la'achar shenimkar hasfarim, aval im lo niskar shum zman, ein makom le'isser klal. He says, but if the books have already been sold, and there was no disclaimer, there was no prohibition, no statement of all rights reserved made by the original printer, then what right? Then he doesn't even hold the copyright. And therefore there's nothing for him legally to sell to someone who would like to now take the rights and to reprint it. Yes?
What they're, just to be clear in my head, so what their argument is the placement on the page, because none of them have the right to the actual words, right? They would have published one after the other, they couldn't argue about it.
It would seem that way. It would seem we're dealing with authors who have already passed away, and these authors could have already relinquished their rights of publication, or these books have already been in print. But the patent of this new Shulchan Aruch is that it carries these commentaries on the page itself. And it's not clear if there's a purchase of plates, or if the guy is just, even if he's retypesetting it, but the fact that he's doing it in the exact same format that this fellow wants to do it, and he's purchased the rights to do it from this original printer, he says that's the dispute. So after the Sholem Meshiv records the counterclaim of the fellow who says, I have a right to print this as much as anyone else does, and I don't need to get permission, so the Sholem Meshiv writes, he says, V'hinei kol devarav temuhim. He says, this is all just amazing. It's astounding. It's astonishing what this fellow says. D'zeh vadai shesefer chadashim atfis mechaber v'zacha shedvarav miskablim al pnei tevel. He says, it's clear to me that if you have a new book that an author prints, and he is successful in having his book sold throughout the world, Pshita sheyesh lo b'zuchus vazeh le'olam. It is clear to me that he maintains a permanent copyright. It's the rights of the publication are the authors. V'harei b'lav hachi im madfisim o mechadshim ezem malacha eno rashai acher la'asos below reshuso. He says, and even without this idea of an author having his work published, he says anytime something is published or some new work product is produced, no one else is allowed to duplicate that work product without the permission of the original creator. Now, then he writes as this, he says, V'harei noda shel Avraham Yaakov mehor b'shav she'asa ha'cheshbon b'mashin kol yamav kibel scharo me ha'kesar yarum hodo b'varsha. He says, we know that Rabbi Avraham Yaakov of Harobshav, and I'm not sure if that's the name of the place, it seems like that's the name of the place, and I'll get to his story in just a minute. He says he made a calculation in a machine his entire life, and because of that he received a stipend or some kind of salary from the government for his entire life. And we'll get to the story of that in just a second, because up until just a short while ago, I had no idea what he was talking about. And he did this in Warsaw. He says, "V'lo yehi Torah shalema shalanu kesicha b'teila shalahem." He says, what, you think our Torah, our halachic system, should be like just prattle, and meaningless prattle in the eyes of their law? In other words, why should our law be any less important or be any less considerate of work product than secular law? He says, "V'zeh davar shehaseichel makchisha." He says that's counterintuitive. That one should think that halacha is more liberal than societal law about protecting the rights of a creator. Umasim b'chol yom shahamatvis chipur yeshlo ulaboi kocho zuchos. And he says, and it's therefore very clear that in the Welt, in the world itself, that anyone who publishes a work, that he is able to hold the rights to that work, and so too do his descendants, or those who come in with his rights if they purchase the rights from him. He says, so you have to understand the appeal of this argument. And it could be that that's why this argument is not made until the 19th century. He's saying, look, this is the way the world works today. There are very sophisticated creations that people make both on an intellectual level and based on new technology. He says, do you expect that the government will protect the rights of a creator of intellectual property and the halacha would not? So you understand, perhaps this is the first time that this argument becomes an important argument, because society has, this is an example of where society caught up to this idea and the halacha had not yet been formulated, crystallized behind that idea, other than to say, look, this is, Yosher dictates this, and look, even society recognizes that Yosher dictates this, right? So what is this case of this Rabbi Avraham Yaakov Mehor Bishov, who made a cheshbon b'machine? He made a calculation in a machine. I had no idea what he was talking about until I did a search in Wikipedia. Okay, so let me tell you what I found out. The Wikipedia entry is Chaim Selig Slonimsky. Has anyone ever heard of this man? Chaim Selig Slonimsky. He was born in 1810 and died in 1904. He was a Hebrew publisher, astronomer, inventor, and science author. He was born in Bialystok, and he pioneered the education of Jews in Eastern Europe in science. And by the way, his beard is much, much longer than mine. His yarmulke is much bigger than mine. I just want to make sure you see that picture, okay? Now, he says, and it says in the entry as follows: when Slominsky was only 24 years old, he finished writing a textbook on mathematics, but due to lack of funds, only the first part of which was published in 1834 under the title of Mosdei Chochma. In 1835, Slominsky released Sefer Kukba Deshevet, a collection of essays on the Halley's Comet and other astronomy-related topics such as laws of Kepler and Newton. This work significantly increased Slominsky's popularity because Halley's Comet was widely discussed topic as the return of this periodic comet was expected in 1835. In 1838, Chaim Selig Slominsky settled in Warsaw, where he became acquainted with mathematician and inventor Avraham Yaakov Stern. This is the Avraham Yaakov that is being quoted in this tshuva from Horobshov, which is, Horobshov is probably the town where he came from, later becoming his son-in-law. So, this fellow, Chaim Selig, is now the son-in-law of this Avraham Yaakov Stern, when in 1842 he married Stern's youngest daughter, Sarah. In 1842, Slominsky created a calculating machine, probably together with his father-in-law, and that's where we get this connection, which he exhibited to the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences. He was awarded the Demidov Prize of 2,500 rubles. In 1844, he published a formula for calculating the Jewish calendar that was far simpler than previously known methods. In 1853, he invented a chemical process for plating iron vessels with lead to prevent corrosion, and in 1856, a device for sending quadruple telegrams. The system of multiple telegraphy perfected by Lord Kelvin in 1858 was based on Slonimsky's discovery. And the article goes on and on and on. So if anyone wants a copy of this, I'll just leave it right over here. You can pick it up later. This is what the Sholem Meshiv is referring to. He's referring to this fellow Chaim Selig Slominsky, but really he's quoting his father-in-law. His father-in-law apparently collaborated with his son-in-law to invent this calculating machine, which won a 2,500 ruble prize because the government recognized that this was an intellectual property that could advance society. And if that's what society acknowledges is important to pay for, we have to pay for it and protect that author's or creator's rights as well. So therefore, he says, and we'll continue, we skip to the next section which is underlined. He says, Uma shenimsa basfarim shahamechaber madfis v'gozren atzman mugbal Okay, so what about the argument that the counterclaimant made, this Reb Yoseph Tzvi, that he made the claim, he says, after all, the original publication of the Shulchan Aruch with the Pri Megadim and the Chavos Das and the Pischei Tshuva didn't have any disclaimer, didn't have any statement of all rights reserved, and it didn't say what is normally appears in Sfarim, that the custom was the publisher hereby bans anyone from publishing the Sefer for 50 years, or for 25 years, right, until the publisher has a chance to recoup his investment, right? So there was no such disclaimer in the original publication that Aleph Yud has purchased from. So what right does he have? He says, Lav mishum she'en lo keach le'asar alamis ze'eno. He says, don't think that you only have a limited right to hold on to the publication rights of a book for a limited period of time. He says, Dibishalo Adam Rashai Ligzor Shalo Yatfiso Lamis Bilti Rishuso O Bal Korcho. He says, don't think that without that disclaimer a person cannot prevent people from publishing his book after a certain amount of time or forever. Raksha Adarabba, Hamachaber Ba'atzma Rotza Sheyatfisu Svarav Achar Sheyizka Limkor Svarav, Umavake Sheyafutsu Devarav Al Pinei Tevel. He says it's just the opposite. The reason why such a disclaimer is normally written in Sfarim that we've seen printed up until now is I hereby place a ban on people publishing my Sefer for the next 20 years is not because he doesn't have a right unless he makes that statement. Just the opposite. Without any statement of all, it's permanently usher to publish the Sefer. What he's giving permission is to people to saying, I hereby give permission that after 20 years you can start reprinting my Sefer. Why? Because I'm happy for this Sefer to be printed and to be freely available to others because I want my intellectual property to get out there once I've recouped my investment. In other words, I want to make my millions, right? Halavai, we should have people that are creative today. They should say, listen, I made $6 billion already. I've made enough. Now let's make Microsoft Windows free, right? What do we have to charge for it anymore, right? I've already made a few $1 billion. Let's make it all free now. There's no reason. We don't need to make more money. That's the import of whenever you find this in a Sefer, he's saying, that the publisher or the printer is inviting people to spread the intellectual property more because doesn't every creator want others to enjoy his intellectual property after he's recouped his investment and he's made a nice parnasa? That's the argument. Aval im be'emes mechaber sefer hanitzrach kein sefer pischei tshuva sherabu hakonim mipnei shu melukat meharbe sfarim v'hamorim tzrichim lo ki ito kulei alma v'shayli b'kitzur pshita sheyesh koach biyado. He says, if, however, a person is the mechaber of a sefer, especially like a sefer that is so necessary, like Sefer Pischei Tshuva, that so many people are purchasing because it's a collection of so many other sources that are hard to collect on one's own, and kiyasi v'shayli b'kitzuro, and he demands a limitation. Pshita sheyesh koach biyadu. He does have a right to hold back the rights and to prevent people from printing it. And then he says, it's a much longer tshuva, we're just taking small portions of it. He says, Umasha kosav shahamachaber lo kosav iser, hine af im lo haya kosav iser, haya asr lahasig gevulo. He says, and the fact that you wrote that the original publisher never put any limitations on copying the press, he says, even if he didn't write anything, it's still prohibited to encroach. And here you have the term hasagas gevul. It's an encroachment upon his rights. Just like you can't encroach on someone's field, you can't encroach on someone's intellectual property. Any venture that I could potentially enterprise off of, that I could potentially make money off of, it doesn't have to be real estate. It could be intellectual property. If you are trying to encroach on my rights, on my invention, on my publication, on my intellectual property, that's no different from encroaching on my field. He says, Aval be'emes b'medinas Russia, Isser v'cherem v'konam asr lahazkir, v'lo yishama alpinu. He says, but there's another reason why an author might not, or a publisher might not write a special, statement at the beginning of the book, I hereby ban anyone from publishing it. He says, because it's illegal. In Russia, it's illegal to write, you are hereby placed in cherem if you copy this book. He says, because the government does not want anyone to impose religious law upon others. You have to exercise civil law. You can't exercise religious law by making a statement that, Sharia law will put you, or whatever, Jewish law will put you under a ban if you do such and such and such. That's the reason why he says that you can't do it. Ki mitzad hamemshala ein koach biyadam ligzor af levakesh. He says we can only make a request according to civil law. You can only request of people that they not duplicate this. He says, "Umehai taima lo ne'amar shumi sur," and that's the reason why it could be that the original printer did not say explicitly that it is prohibited to go ahead and reprint this. V'gam b'medina seino yesh chok b'hadfasa mibeli lahadfis mitzad chukei hamemshala umah koach based in Yafeh ki im yasu derech bakasha. He says, and therefore you have to exercise the laws of the land. He says the law of the land is that you're not allowed to reprint someone else's printing. He says that's the governmental law, and therefore you can't say that the Beis Din would have more power than the government itself. And then he goes on and he says, and that even though sometimes we do find that when people publish a new sefer, they do write you're going to be put in cherem and a konam and all of these other religious bans that are placed upon you. He says the government looks the other way. Even though technically it's against the law to write that, it's a violation of sort of you're trying to supersede civil law, the government looks the other way. But it could very well be that this Erlich Yid who published the Shulchan Aruch to begin with, the reason why he didn't write it was because he knew that it was illegal to write it, and not because he didn't want people to not republish his sefer. He didn't want people to republish his sefer. He wanted to hold on to the rights, but he relied upon the government's enforcement of the law, which is also hasagas gevul according to halacha. Okay, then so that therefore his conclusion is that Aleph Yud is right in his claim, and therefore this other fellow who's trying to republish the Shulchan Aruch without getting the rights, and Aleph Yud purchased the rights, Aleph Yud is in the right, and he can stop the other guy from publishing the Shulchan Aruch with all of the nosei kelim. Okay, that was the conclusion of the Sholem Meishiv. We then take a look at a tshuva that is written shortly after this. It's not clear exactly the number of years difference between the two tshuvas, but Rav Yitzchak Yehuda Shmelkis is a Talmud of the Sholem Meishiv, and this is in Beis Yitzchak Yoredeya Chelik Beis Simin Ayin Hey. So he writes actually to, I think this is either the son or the grandson of the Chassam Sofer, and he writes as follows. I just put a box around the two parts that we want to see for tonight. He says, Bidvar HaShe'ela Mi Shehiniach Kisvei Chidushei Torah Imutter La'acher Lahatik Mehem Ulahadfisam Shelo Birshus HaYorshim Af Im Hetik B'Chaye HaMachaber O Yesh Bo Mishum Gazel. The question is, someone leaves over Chidushei Torah, novella, if I think that's the word, right? All right. He writes different things in Torah literature. Is it permitted for another person to publish that Torah literature without getting permission from the heirs of the author? And would there be a difference if the author himself had published the work during his lifetime or not? So that's the question. And without going into the first part of the tshuva, he says, we'll just look at the boxed area. He says, Uvazeh b'hashkafa rishona lo eda hefreish beini im shama ba'al peh chidushei Torah o ra'a bichsav. He says, I don't see the problem. He says, I don't see that there should be any difference between whether a person read chidushei Torah and then transcribes them, or he hears a shiur orally and seeks to transcribe the shiur. He says, just like when a rabbi gives a drasha, it's free information, and he's not banning people from disseminating the drasha that he gave. So too, when a person gives over a Devar Torah, there's no isser for anyone to just transcribe that Devar Torah. And similarly, if he's already transcribed the Dvar Torah and someone else reads it, it's no different from if the person had said the Dvar Torah. So therefore, if I can transcribe Rabbi so-and-so's Divrei Torah from an oral presentation, why can't I transcribe so-and-so's Divrei Torah from a written presentation? That's the argument. What's the ban on intellectual property? So he doesn't see any problem with it. He says, "V'haga atzmecha."
There's a big difference. I mean, you can't sell what you heard, but you can sell what you write. Like, in other words, I can repeat it, but I'm not really making money on that.
Well, I don't know. You can't really sell kisvei yad, can you? I mean, let's say a person takes notes. He needs someone to transcribe it. So you can't sell it in its raw form either, just like you can't sell oral information in its raw form.
But once you show that, I think you can probably sell kitvei yad. You can sell I'm taking the kitvei yad and I'm reproducing it in
I can sell a shear too, Samuel.
You cannot,
I can sell a shear
unless you pay.
I can charge admission to this year. Not too many people would come, I'm sure, but I can still charge admission, right? So
then I'm coming to hear you. I'm not coming with particular words. To me, it seems a difference between something voiced and something written.
Okay, but this is his argument. Okay, and he says, "V'haga atzmacha." He says, "I'll prove it to you." Harei sheshama me'echad chidushay Torah, o shalamad etzlo hachi. He says, let me make the argument. He says, if you hear chidushay Torah from someone, you hear a shiur from your Rebbe, you're going to tell me that it's not permitted to say over the chidushay Torah that you heard from your Rebbe? I mean, it's one thing to say that, if you take credit for it and you say, I came up with a beautiful chiddush and let me share it with you. But as long as you're giving proper attribution, what's the problem? He says, "Va'afilu la'alfei alofim talmidim hamakshivim lakolo." He says, and even if you wanted to say it over to thousands of people, and therefore you're sort of ruining the originators, the creators' divrei Torah from ever being able to enterprise, because now it becomes out in the public domain. But of course it's mutter. V'lama imra'a b'kesavim lo yuchal lefarsem b'shem omro lema'an shmaitza yibadran ba'alma. Now remember, here the author is arguing that when it comes to Divrei Torah, he says there's an assumption that Divrei Torah you want to spread far and wide as possible. And certainly the way that Beis Yitzchak is speaking, he's not dealing with other kinds of intellectual property. He's not dealing with a calculating machine like the Sholem Eshiv was. He's dealing specifically with Chidushay Torah. And so therefore that could potentially change his attitude if he was asked the question about a guy who invents this amazing calculating machine. But of course, that's not his world. He doesn't have to deal with that. He says, "Ach yesh lechalek." Maybe says so. Like Samuel says, maybe there is a difference between written divrei Torah and oral divrei Torah. He says, "Dekeshashama mimenu ba'al peh im lo omer lo beval yomar harei lo hikpid im yomer la'acher." He says, when it comes to an oral Dvar Torah presentation, the very fact that he's willing to share with you information orally is an indication that he doesn't mind if you share it with others, unless he tells you explicitly, this is not to leave this room. Please do not share this with others. Ve'im omar lo beval yomar vaday aser lomer la'acherim dahatorah v'hachidush dilehu. He says, and if he says, I have this amazing chiddush, I'm going to tell you, but don't tell anyone else, then you have to respect his wishes. Why? He says, because he says, because it could be, he says, I'm a little bit insecure about this chiddush. I want to keep it to myself for now, but I'm only willing to share it with you. Right? There are a lot of times when I have ideas, and I think that the ideas, even if they're Torah ideas, I think that, some people wouldn't appreciate the idea. They would think it perhaps somewhat heretical, or they might think that it's outlandish. And therefore, I might only want to present it to a friend who understands where I'm coming from and that wouldn't want to go far and wide. He says, right? He says, "Aval below Amar shelo yomar mutter lilmod la'acherim." He says, but if a person doesn't give you explicit instructions, please don't share this with others, then of course, after an oral presentation, you are allowed to share it with others. Va'adarabba osa mitzvah bazeh. And not only that, you're doing a mitzvah by spreading Torah. Masha'enken kishiyesh lo ksavim But if there's written literature, even if it's handwritten Torah literature, Hinei im hetik b'rishus ha'mechaber, v'ha'mechaber lo amar lo shemakbid shelo yar'eh la'acherim, he says, if this was transcribed with the permission of the author, and the author never said, do not show it to anyone else, vaday maskim sheyilmodim acherim. He says, there too, you can assume that he wants you to teach it to other people. V'hu adin shemutar lahadfis. Ach keshehetik shelo b'yediyas ha'mechaber. But if you transcribe it without the author's knowledge, O shelo b'yediyas haryorshim, or without the knowledge of the heirs of the mechadesh, of the creator of the property, yesh listapek, then we can get into a doubt. He says, like Shmuel was trying to say, he says, I can hear perhaps there is a difference between written chidushei Torah and oral chidushei Torah, because when it comes to oral chidushei Torah, there you know for a fact that the author doesn't mind for his ideas to be spread far and wide, because he's giving it over to a group of people. And without placing any limitations, you know that it's implicit that he doesn't mind if you go and share it with others. But with information that's transcribed, you don't know for a fact that the author realized that this was being transcribed and that was being shared with others. Maybe he never had any intention of sharing it with others, and it's not as implicit in the presentation of the literature that it's the desire of the author to have this shared with others, or that he wants to, or that he wants to keep it for himself. He says that's the only area where he says I'm not so clear cut on it. But yet, going back to the whole shaila of is intellectual property free, or do you have to pay the author, he continues on with the tshuva. And this, we're skipping a whole bunch, and we're going to Os Dalet now. You have to turn the page. V'hineni chozer l'guf hadin. Let me go back to the actual law. He says, Hinei nir'eh. Da'af im hirsha ha'mechaber b'chayav laha'atik miktsas mehaksavim. He says, even if the author gave permission to transcribe some of his divrei Torah, mikol makom asur lahatfisam b'li rishus hayorshim, you still would not be allowed to print it without permission of the heirs. De'ika umdana shahamechaber lo hirsha lahatik rak l'tzorach atzmo sheyilmod mehem. Avalo sheyifitzem al pnei tevel. He says, but maybe it could be that the author only wanted to keep this in the family, not that it should be spread to the entire world. Demiderech ha'olam sheyorshav yatfisu v'yotziu la'or. He says, because usually the author wishes to leave that right to his heirs to do. Vim acher yadfis as I lo yuchlu yorshav lahatfis lahotzi hotzos ulay yadfis acher achar kach b'terem sheyimkru yorshim hasforim. He says, but if other people would print it, and other people would have a right to print it, the heirs would not undertake the investment of printing it themselves, because they would always be worrying that maybe someone else will print it, and we won't recoup our investment. And so therefore that's going to create problems for the heirs. Or someone else may reprint it in a slightly different form and leave out some of the writing. Alkein umdina. V'kol shekenim hasefer v'haksavim shavim mamon kemo shtaros sheyorshim hu adin ksavim u'bevadei asel acher la'atik haksavim u'latfisam shelo birshus hayorshim. And therefore you always have to get permission from the heirs. And here's the big but. He says, Amnon, im kvar hitfis ha'mechaber sifro. He says, if, however, the author already printed his book during his lifetime, hine kol zman shelo machar svara vadei aser la'acher lahadfis, Pam shenis lahafsid lahamachabro liyorshav. He says, then I agree it would be aser, absolutely, for anyone else to print it until he's had a chance to sell all of the books that he printed. Ulam im kvar mochar svarav basei yesh la'ayin. But if he's already sold off his first print, he's recouped his investment, he's made money off of his intellectual property already, he says, Daharei hamachaber hotzi lo'or, Chavas daito umachar svarav harshus biyad kol adam lilmod ululamed. And then it says it becomes everyone's right to share someone else's intellectual property. In other words, what the Beis Yitzchak is essentially saying is, you have a right to enterprise off of your intellectual property after you've sold your first run of books. Once you've sold your first run of books, you've recouped your investment, then anyone else who wants to come along and reprint has a right to reprint. Now, this is not the end of the tshuva.